Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Shabbos Daf Kuf Zayin is a rather long daf with a nice chunk of Agadata stuck in the middle. It begins in the middle of a discussion about clearing out a storeroom. As we had said, there's a couple of different issues clearing a storeroom. You might not be able to access any of the things there because they're muktzah. You didn't intend to use them during Shabbos, so muktzah is one issue. Another issue is tircha, too much work to clear out a storeroom. And then the Gemara will discuss each of those two, and then it'll discuss how much you're allowed to move out. It doesn't depend on the number of guests you have. Then we'll launch into Agadata about the mitzvah achnasas archim, and about the obligation to judge people favorably. And then the Gemara at the end of the daf will go back to the question of clearing the storehouse and discuss which items you're allowed to move because they're usable on Shabbos and which items you're not allowed to, even though they're food, because you cannot use them on Shabbos. So first of all, as far as clearing out a storehouse, so we had seen a mission discussing clearing out a storehouse on Shabbos, and again there are two major issues. First of all, if you didn't intend to use the storehouse, if this is your first time opening up a new storehouse, so everything in there is muktzah, you mentally did not consider anything in there as usable on Shabbos. So therefore we had halacha that you're not allowed to open a new storehouse on Shabbos, and we said that was dependent on the machlekes Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Yehuda holds of muktzah, and Rabbi Shimon is much less likely to apply muktzah to things, and therefore he holds that it's not a problem. Okay, so lefi Rabbi Yehuda, you would not be allowed to open a new storehouse on Shabbos. According to Rabbi Shimon, you should be allowed to. That's what the Gemara had said so far. So the Gemara now has a brisa, or two, maybe three, and we're going to try to fit in with these opinions. First of all, we have a brisa that says as follows. You're not allowed to open a new storehouse on Shabbos, but you are allowed to make a path to walk through it. The Gemara says, how could you do that? How could you make a path? It's muktzah. The objects in there are muktzah. What are you supposed to do? The Gemara says, you move it out of here with your feet. As you're walking, you kind of shuffle the objects in there out of the way. That's moving it kilach hayad, and therefore that's not a problem, even though it's muktzah. Next brisa. Brisa says that piled up grain that you started to take from before Shabbos, you're allowed to continue to take from on Shabbos, but if you didn't start before Shabbos, you're not allowed to start now. Again, it's the same idea. It counts as a storehouse that you didn't touch, and therefore it's muktzah. But the Gemara says that this is the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, and Rav Acha argues. The Gemara says that's backwards. Rabbi Shimon says it's usher. Rabbi Shimon is the one who holds that it's not a problem, muktzah. So the Gemara says, yeah, switch it. Rabbi Shimon is the one who says it's okay. Rav Acha is the one who says it is a problem. Okay, now the Gemara has a shaila. The Gemara says, what is the minimum size of piled up grain to be considered a storehouse? So the Gemara says it is a lesech. A lesech is half a kor, it's equal to 15 saw. Also notes that Rabbi Nechumi bar Zechariah asked Abaye this question, he answered him, yeah, it's a lesech, that's how much is considered to be a storehouse. Okay, now the Gemara is going to go to the next subject, which is about the tircha. We had said that clearing out a storehouse is too much work on Shabbos. You don't want to do that, you don't want to empty out a storehouse. And therefore, the limit you're allowed to take out, the Gemara had seen in the Mishnah, was 4 or 5 boxes. So the Gemara says 4 or 5 boxes. So Gemara now says, what if I can take that same amount of, let's say it's grain or containers of oil or wine, whatever it is, and I can divide it up into smaller packages. Let's say it'll be 15 boxes, but each one is a third the size. So can I carry those out? On one hand, it's less to schlep each time. It's not as heavy. On the other hand, it's more trips back and forth. So is that considered more work or less work? When we calculate work, do we look at how much weight you're carrying, or do we look at how many trips you have to make? So the Gemara wants to say that this is actually a machlokes tanaim. We have two brises, and it seems to be that each brisa holds one of these two sides. What's the brises? It's referring to carrying boxes filled with jugs of oil or wine. One of them says you can have 4 or 5 boxes, and the other one says 10 or 15. So the Gemara wants to say, obviously the one that says 4 or 5 holds you better off. It's less work if you make less trips with heavier loads. The other one says, no, you're better off having 10 or 15 trips with lighter loads. So the Gemara says, no, that's not what's going on. Actually, these two brises don't argue at all. They're just counting different things. The 4 or 5 boxes is counting boxes. The 10 or 15 is counting jugs. And it's all 4 or 5 boxes. And it's coming to tell you, you could have the same amount of oil be in 4 or 5. You could have 4 or 5 jugs in 4 or 5 boxes if the jugs are so big that each box holds only one jug. Or you could have 10 jugs if the jugs are small enough that you fit it 2 in a box. You can even have 3 if they're tiny jugs like the one from a place called Harpania. You can fit 3, and if you could have 15 jugs in 4 or 5 boxes. But really I agree that it's the same amount, and everybody agrees that you'd rather have less trips. You only want to make 4 or 5 trips. You don't want to have to do a jug at a time. Okay, that concludes that discussion. I think I want to know this number, 4 or 5 boxes, is that a standard amount, or does it depend how many guests you have? Let's say you have lots and lots of guests, so you're allowed to take more food out of the storehouse. Next, the Gemara says, assuming you could take more out of the storehouse, is one person allowed to take out the food from the storehouse for all the guests, or does he have to call the guests to come down and take him out bit by bit with each person not exceeding the maximum amount? So the Gemara has a story here, two versions of the story. We're going to try to answer the question from the story. So the Gemara says, what's the story? The story is that Rebbe was once looking for a place to teach his Talmidim, and the room they were in was too small. So he went out to the field, but the field was filled with bundled grain. So he said, you know what, we're going to carry the grain in. There's no Erev. You carry it in less than 4 amas at a time, stopping and starting. And you're allowed to move it out of the field. It's not a problem of storehouse because we're trying to make place for everybody. And so he ended up clearing the entire field. That's the first version of the story. The second version is that it wasn't Rebbe, it was Rebbe Chia. Either way, you see that if you have a lot of Talmidim that need to sit, you're allowed to clear out the grain. So it's not one standard amount. It depends on how many students you have. So he says, okay, I hear that. But now, was it all carried by one person, or was it carried by a bunch of individuals? So it says, if you look at the wording of the story, it says that Rebbe cleared the entire field. You see, Rebbe did it all himself. The says, Rebbe did it himself? He didn't do it all himself. It can't be that he did it all himself. Rebbe was the Nasi. It means that Rebbe gave the order. So if Rebbe gave the order, we still don't know if one person's allowed to, if he ordered one person to do all of them, or if he had everybody, each one take one, and deal with that. Okay, now the Gemara launches in some Agadat over here. We saw in our Mishnah that you're allowed to clear the storehouse, or allowed to remove things from the storehouse for the sake of guests, or for the sake of finding a place for people to learn. So the Gemara says, you see that hosting people, the mitzvah of Achnas Zarchim and the mitzvah of getting a brother to go to the Beis Medrash, are both on equal footing because we compare the two. They both have the same mile. The Gemara says, no, actually guests are more important because it's listed first. And the Gemara says, you know what, another thing, hosting guests, Achnas Zarchim, is more important than even greeting the Shekhinah. Like we see by Avraham Avinu, when he greeted the Malachim, he said, Hashem, use the name Alf Dalad Nun Yud, which Rashi there brings this Gemara could be referring to Hashem. And he said, please don't leave, I have to go and greet my guests now. So you see, he could tell Hashem to wait while he goes to greet the guests, because the guests are more important. Now the Gemara says, you can see from this another thing. Rabbi Elazar says, you see how much HaKadosh Baruch Hu is different than others. If you have a big fancy leader and you tell him, wait while I go greet my guests, he's not going to wait around. He's going to be far too full of himself. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you could say, wait. Even though he is the Gadol, obviously, he could wait while I go greet the Ketanim, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Kaviyachol, is not offended. Okay, now the Gemara says the following thing. There are 6 things that a person reaps reward in this world, and the actual schar, the principle, remains waiting for him in the world to come. And these are the following things: Achnas Zarchim, greeting the guests; Bikur Cholim, visiting the sick; Ian Tefillah, praying with Kavana; Ashkamas Beis Medrash, getting up early to go to the Beis Medrash; raising your children to be Talmidei Chachamim; and judging your friend favorably. Dan Kafs Chosim says, this is very interesting because there's 2 things on the list that are not on the Mishnah in Paya that we say every morning. We don't say anything about raising children to Torah. We don't say anything about judging favorably. So the Gemara quotes the Brisa. It doesn't quote the whole. The Gemara quotes the Mishnah. It doesn't quote the whole thing, the beginning and the end. And it says, but it doesn't say these 2 things. So obviously they're not on the list. So who has the right to add these things to the list? So the Gemara says, no, they're included. They're included in the other things on the list. Rashi explains that judging favorably is included in bringing peace between people, because if you judge someone favorably when they did something wrong to you, you will not end up getting mad at him, and you will limit the arguments. And raising children to be Talmidei Chachamim is included in Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam, that the learning of the Torah is greater than anything else. Okay, now the Gemara brings 3 stories about people who were great or excelled in the midah of judging others favorably. The first one, the Gemara doesn't bring names, but it's Rabbi Akiva was the worker, and Rabbi Elazar Hagadol, who was the employer. And it says that there was a worker who was working for 3 years, and then his period of work ended on Erev Yom Kippur, and he said to the boss, can you please give me my salary? And I can go home and I can feed my wife and his children finally after 3 years. So he said, I don't have anything to give you, don't have any money. He said, so give me fruits, I don't have. Give me land, I don't have. Give me animals, I don't have. Give me pillows and blankets, I don't have. He packed up his backpack and he went home in a very depressed state. Okay, that was Erev Yom Kippur. After Sukkot came the employer with 3 donkeys loaded up with good food, and he brought all the money and drink and everything and fancy delights, and he came to the house of the worker, and they sat down and they ate and they drank together, and he gave him his money, and then he said, tell me the truth. When I told you I don't have money to pay you, and you saw that there was, that I'm a wealthy individual, what do you think? He said, I assume you must have found a good investment, and you invested all your money right then, and you didn't have anything to pay me. So what about when I said I have no animals, and so I have animals? He said, I thought you must have rented them. They must have been rented out to others. When you saw I had no land, when I said I had no land, what do you think? Obviously I have land. He said, I thought it must have been leased to somebody else to work and take a portion, a fixed amount of the produce, and therefore you couldn't give me the land. And then when I said no fruits, what? He said, I thought maybe you didn't take meiser. When I said I have no pills and blankets, what do you think? He said, I thought you must have been makdish all your property to the Beis HaMikdash. You vowed, and you said everything that you have belongs to the Beis HaMikdash. You said, ha'avoda, a language of swearing, that's the truth. My son didn't want to learn, he didn't want to go to yeshiva, and I therefore warned him that you're not going to get any inheritance, and I was makdish everything, and then he went to yeshiva, and then I was able to go to the Talmidei Chachamim for a Pesach to cancel my vow. Okay. Now he said, the same way that you judged me favorably, may HaKadosh Baruch Hu always judge you favorably. Okay, next story. There was a tzaddik, the verse is a chassid, that redeemed a young girl who was captive, and he redeemed her, and he was traveling, and he stopped at a hotel, and he had her sleep in his room at the foot of his bed, and then in the morning he got up and he went to the mikvah. Clear indication that he must have had some kind of relations the night before, or some sort of other emission. So the Gemara says, so he asked the students, when I took her to sleep in my room, what did you suspect me of? They said, well, I guess you probably didn't know us Talmidim too well. You didn't know if you could trust us. And then he said, okay, that's correct. And then when I went to the mikveh, what did you think? He said, well, I thought it must be, they said, we thought that it must be because of all the travel, it caused a seminal emission, because we know that traveling too much causes that. And he said, that is the truth. Both of those are correct. And just like you judged me favorably, may the Hashem always judge you favorably as well. Third story. There was once an incident where the Talmidei Chachamim needed to go to a certain woman in Rome to help them with a certain political issue. Now this woman was a prostitute, and all of the great leaders of Rome frequented her house. So the Talmidei Chachamim thought to themselves, who's going to be the one to go? And Rabbi Yeshua said, I'm going to go. So he went with his students, and they came. He didn't tell them what it was for or why he was going. When they came to her house, he went into her house, locked the door, came out in the morning, and he first took off his tefillin 4 amos away from her house, went into the house, locked the door, came out, and went to the mikvah. So he said to them, so that doesn't look too good. What do you suspect me of? When I took my tefillin off, what did you think? It would seem to be an indication that he's about to do a maisa. So but they said, no, we figured you don't want to wear your tefillin into a tamei, unclean house like that. He said, correct. And then when I locked the door, what do you think? They said, we thought you must have had some important secret government mission that you have to discuss with her. And he said, that is correct. And then he said, when I went to the mikveh, what did you think? They said, we thought that she must have had some spit fly on you. And we know that the halacha is that the spittle of a goy has a din of a spit of a zav, and it's matame, and therefore you have to go to the mikveh. And he said, you are correct. In the same way you judged me favorably, may HaKadosh Baruch Hu always judge you favorably. Okay, now the Gemara goes back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah had a list of things which you are allowed to move, you aren't allowed to move. The rule being those that you're allowed to eat or use, you're allowed to move, because they're not muktzah, and the ones that you can't, you aren't allowed to move. Now, some of these are obvious that they're mutter, and some of these are less obvious. The Gemara is going to ask about the obvious one. So the Gemara says, first of all, you said truma tahira, truma that you're allowed to move. Why would I think not? Why would I think you're not allowed to move truma? You're allowed to eat it. So the Gemara says that we are referring to where the truma is in the house of a Yisrael. He is not allowed to eat it, but he's still allowed to move it because he could call a kohen, and the kohen would be allowed to, even though he himself is not. Now, demai. Gemara asks demai. How is he allowed to move demai? Demai is not. He can't eat demai. Demai is fruits that you bought from an amaretz, and you don't know if he took meiser from it or not. So how are you allowed to move it? So the Gemara says no, because there is a way to make yourself permitted to eat it. Because you can be mafkir, you can abandon all your property, then you become poor, and a poor person is allowed to eat demai, like we saw in the Brisa. You're allowed to eat demai, you're allowed to feed it to the poor people, and you're allowed to feed it to the soldiers that are quartered in your house. Now the Gemara has a different version of that. Rav Huna says it's actually machlekes. Beis Shammai says you're not allowed to. Beis Hillel says you are allowed to, and of course we pass on Beis Hillel, and therefore you are allowed to. Next on the list is Meiser that Truma was already taken off from. That means as follows. What you're supposed to do with the grain is the Yisrael who harvests the grain is supposed to take off Truma Gedoyla and give it to the Kohen. Then he takes off Meiser, gives it to the Levi, and the Levi takes off Trumas Meiser from his portion and he gives it to the Kohen. So the Gemara understands that this means that the Levi got his Meiser and he took off Trumas Meiser and he gave it to the Kohen. So the Gemara says then it's obvious. You should be allowed to eat that. What's the problem? What does the Mishnah have to say that you're allowed to eat that and it's not a muktzah? So the Gemara says we're not referring to where Trumas Meiser was taken off. We're referring to the following thing. We're referring to where the Yisrael took the grain before it was threshed out of the stalks. It's still attached to the stalks. He took the stalks with the grain on them and he gave it to the Levi. He never gave it to the Kohen first. Then the Levi went and he gave Trumas Meiser from his portion, but he didn't give the original Meiser, the original Truma that the Kohen was supposed to get. So the halachas doesn't have to give that. How do you know? Because it says you only have to give Meiser from the Meiser. You don't have to give Truma Gedela from the Meiser. You got Meiser, you don't have to give Truma from that. So the Gemara says, why is that only true if it's still in the stalks? If you threshed it out and now it's a heap of grain, why don't you also not have to give that? The Gemara says, what do you mean? It says, you have to give Truma from everything. The Gemara says, well, let's go back and forth over here. So then you should have to, even if it's in the stalks, you should have to give it. The Gemara says, no, because there it has to be that it's from the dagon, from the grain. Grain is when it's already threshed and it's a pile of just kernels. If it's still in the stalks, it doesn't apply. Therefore, the Levi doesn't have to give that Truma Gedela, and that's the Chiddush over here. This is a series of steps which appears in a number of places. We also had a Masechta Brachos not too long ago. Okay, next thing on the list is Meiser Sheni was redeemed. The Gemara says, what's a Chiddush there? Meiser Sheni was redeemed for sure. It's okay. The Gemara answers again, like we saw in Brachos, it's referring to where you redeem the Meiser Sheni, but you did not pay the extra fifth. The halacha is when you redeem something, Meiser Sheni or Hektish, you have to give an extra fifth of the value, and here he didn't do that, but that's not a problem. He's still allowed to eat it. Next on the list is a dried tormos bean, where it says only dried, but if it would be fresh, you wouldn't be allowed to move it because it's too bitter to.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.